Everyone, and welcome to our Squirrel Hill Historical Society meeting. I am Helen Wilson, Vice President. Our President, Jim Hammond, decided to spend the winter in Florida. So I will be filling in for him for a few months. So a few announcements. Our membership drive has started in October. So if you aren't a member and you sign up, our membership year runs from January 1st to December 31st. So you get these free months. You get October, November, December if you are a new member signing up. Members can sign up anytime, and your membership is good till December 31st next year. So that's the first thing. Oh, membership forms are in the back, or you can renew online. Or join online at our website, squirrelhillhistory.org. Tony,
the website.
Yeah.
Yes.
Spell out squirrelhillhistory.org. Yes.
Okay. All right. And the members of our board who are here tonight are Tony and Davina, who is our email coordinator. If you email a question to the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, he's the one who answers. So let's see, Toby Chapman and Todd Miller are program schedulers, and you do a phenomenal job. Thank you. Todd Wilson, he's recently joined, so we're still finding uses for you. Thank you, thank you. Let's see, anyone else? Audrey, of course. Audrey Glickman is our video media specialist. She tapes the programs. And by the way, the programs are recorded. They are put on YouTube, so just be aware that you could show up on a YouTube video. If you don't want to, then just be aware that you'll be in the line of viewing.
Go behind my camera.
Yeah. And two people that help out quite a bit are my sister Agnes and my longtime friend Drew Porbasnik, who help out at the table in the back. So another announcement is that our upcoming programs, November 4th is not a Squirrel Hill Historical Society program. That's going to be at Carnegie Library, Maine in Oakland. It is the, get this name right, Local History Day at Carnegie Library in Oakland. And we've been participating in this for 4 or 5 years now. And it's a time where local historical societies get together. It's open to the public. You come and talk to people from historical societies all over the place and get to learn about what's going on in different areas of Pittsburgh. So it's a fun day. There's going to be some talks, handouts, just interesting things. And it's always nice to spend time at Carnegie Library anyway. So, okay. November 4th from 1 to 4. And on Tuesday, November 14th, Hidden Pittsburgh History in Stained Glass Windows at Heinz Chapel. And that's by Frank Kurtik, who has given several talks for us. And if you've been to Heinz Chapel, you know the windows are spectacular. And they tell these phenomenal stories. And he's going to talk about that. He was a docent there, and he studied those windows. So that's all I have. Todd is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Helen, and good evening, everyone, here at the Church of the Redeemer, as well as on Zoom. We're glad you're with us this evening, and I'm the program co-scheduler along with Toby Chapman, who's here with his wife Flo tonight. So Toby, thank you for all the work that you do in helping us fill out our programs during the course of the year. And so this evening, our speaker is Dr. Stacy Wentworth. She is a radiation oncologist who practices in Winston Salem, North Carolina. And the title of her presentation is The Life and Accomplishments of Dr. Bernard Fisher, Over the next 45 minutes to an hour, she will explore the life and accomplishments of the late Dr. Fisher, a Squirrel Hill native and a pioneer in biology and the treatment of breast cancer. Dr. Wentworth credits Dr. Fisher's work with saving dozens of her own patients' lives and many other people's lives as well. She's a graduate of Wake Forest University School of Medicine and also received an undergraduate degree from Wake Forest. So at this time, it's my pleasure to present Dr. Stacy Wentworth.
Thank you, Todd. Well, I am just so honored to be here. I found the Squirrel Hill Historical Society during COVID, and it is wonderful to see what is happening on this side of the camera instead of on that side of the camera. So in light of, well, people often ask me, how did you get interested in Dr. Fisher? And meeting some people in the audience who could probably tell this story better than I can. And I guess in light of what's happening in Israel, I thought I would do a reading. I don't know if everyone is familiar with Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. Ms. Horn goes around the world and talks about the stories of Jewish settlements that have come and gone and the violence that has occurred as a result. And one of the places that she talks about is in Syria and in the Middle East. And there's a project there that's called Diara. And it is a virtual project where people go in and take pictures and videos of synagogues that are no longer present or that are present but are at risk for violence. And she says, because of Diara, I see my own American landscape differently. I pass by the tiny 18th century cemetery near my home with its Revolutionary War graves, and I think of the histories that might lie unseen along with the ones we enshrine, wondering whether there might be a Native American burial ground underneath the local Walgreens, whether I am treading on someone else's ancient space. I know that I must be. We are always walking on the dead. Yet something more than time's ravages keeps me returning to Diarna. As I explore the photographs and oral histories they have collected, I find myself reeling from yet another anti-Semitic shooting attack in my own country, this one at a kosher market 20 minutes from my home, its proximity prompting me to hide this information from my Jewish children, avoiding mentioning our murdered neighbors. Within days of these murders, my social media feed was already full of pictures from a different attack, at a Los Angeles synagogue where someone, whether hatefully motivated or simply unstable, trashed the sanctuary, dumping Torah scrolls and prayer books on the floor. The pictures reminded me of Sherman's jarring Diarna pictures of a ruined synagogue in Tunisia, its floor strewn with the holy texts abandoned in piles of dust. Our public spaces today, online and off, are often full of open derision and disrespect for others, of self-serving falsehoods about both past and present, of neighbors turning on neighbors. It's sometimes tough these days not to sense an encroaching darkness. Peering through the windows of Diarna's many ruins, I'm looking for more light. It's hard to recognize other viewpoints if you're in a bubble where everyone thinks like you, Diarna's research coordinator, Ashkenazi, tells me. He's talking about homogenized societies in the Middle East, but he could be talking about anywhere, about all of us. By raising this Jewish history, we're puncturing these bubbles and saying that in your bubble, at one time, not long ago, there once were others with you, he says. It's not so crazy to welcome others. It's not so crazy. I look through the images of our homes, all of our homes, and the windows on my screen are wide open. And so I just set that as the reason that I really admire the work that Dr. Fisher did, because he started to look at things differently. And he came into my life. A little bit about me. I grew up in a small farm town in the middle of Illinois, in a town of about 500 people. When I went onto the campus of Wake Forest University, it was one of the most diverse places I had ever been, which those of you that know it as a Southern Baptist college is saying something. So as I started looking at the history of cancer, I remember hearing about a man who gave women a choice on what surgery they wanted for their breast cancer treatment. And as I talked to women, sometimes they would ask me, well, how do you know that this is the right choice for me? And I said, well, I don't know it. It's based on this data. And I realized that the story of Dr. Fisher's work and other scientists that backed up what he did was starting to be forgotten. And as I talked to the students and residents that rotated through my clinic, I realized that they also didn't know that this had happened. And considering some of Dr. Fisher's seminal work is really barely only 50 years old, I thought that it was important to start telling his story, and his story is definitely undertold. And I will tell it from my perspective, and then for those of you, I might have to unlock. Oh, y'all are going to find out my pin here. There we go. For those of you that are familiar with Dr. Fisher, I would love to hear your stories or contribute anything that you think is important as well. So these are just some people often ask me, what do you read? I'm a big nonfiction reader, and these are some of the nonfiction medical books that I enjoy reading. And then you can find more about me and about the journey that I'm on. Then I'm also doing a Substack newsletter that talks about cancer culture, because I think that there's a lot of what we think cancer is, and then I've seen that when patients are actually coming into my clinic, there's a reality of what it is, and how do we start to bridge that gap between what we think it is and what it really is. So you can sign up for that. Oh, the green arrow is coming on. Oh, here it is. Maybe? Oh, do you want to just go to the next slide? There's no talk is complete without a technological glitch.
Well, I'll advance, but we are redundant. I'll pull out the other one.
Okay.
Well, maybe not. I'll just advance it.
If you just go, I think then probably just the arrows.
It's down.
Okay. All right, here we go. So this is another quote that I use a lot in my talks that really talks about stories. So I think it's important. We are a system and a community that really loves stories. And I am the sum total of the experiences of all the people that I have met who have influenced my life, including my parents, my teachers, my professors, my patients, my nurses, everyone who supported me, and including Dr. Fisher. Next slide. I think it's also important to remember that the stories that we don't hear are the women that signed up for clinical trials. So there were thousands of women, and there are thousands of people that are signing up for clinical trials today, and we don't know their names, they're de-identified, but they are the ones that really, and the women that signed up for Dr. Fisher's trials are really the heroes of this story, even though we won't speak directly about them. And I think the important place, go ahead, next slide. The important place to start is really a history of cancer. So really cancer, up until the 17 and 1800s, nobody really knew what cancer was or what caused it. A lot of different philosophies about bad humors and a lot of different treatments. And those included bloodletting and leeches and topical arsenic and sarsaparilla, anything you can imagine. And there was also a couple of medieval texts that I've seen that definitely for any mass you should drink more wine. That was the conversation that they had about killing cancer cells. Next slide. So the first modern treatment of breast cancer that we start to see is the beloved daughter of our second president, John Adams. His daughter, Nabby Adams, married his secretary while he was ambassador to England and came back, and that gentleman was better at being a secretary than making money, and he made and lost several fortunes and used up all of his credit in being John Adams' son-in-law, and eventually ended up in poverty in a farm in western Massachusetts. Sometime in 1810, Nabby Adams felt a mass in her breast, and she went to the local practitioner that was there, and they said, just put some arsenic paste on it, and if you want to drink some arsenic as well, then we'll go ahead. That'll be the treatment for cancer. She wrote her mom back in Quincy, and Abigail wrote her back and said, I checked with the local doctors here, and they said, yeah, keep doing that. So about 2 years later, it had started to come through the skin. It had started to ulcerate through the skin, and she wrote to her mom and said, I've got pain. I want to come back to Quincy and see what's going on. So she traveled 300 miles over pretty primitive roads in a carriage, came back to Quincy, went around and saw some doctors in Massachusetts, and they all said, yeah, just keep it the topical paste, it's going to be fine. And then she wrote to one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who was actually a friend of her father, and said, hey, I've got this problem. And he had just returned from Europe, and he said, let there be no delay in flying to the knife. And he sent out a surgeon who came to the Adams house and brought his assistant and a very sharp knife. And they took Abby to the second floor bedroom. She was dressed in her Sunday best. He was in a suit. And they strapped her to a chair, and her mother and sister-in-law were there to help her. And then you can read about the procedure that she had. She then spent the winter recovering, so she spent about 6 months recovering from this surgery. And she eventually returned home to the frontier in New York, and about 2 to 3 months later she developed headaches, bone pain, what we all know was likely metastatic disease, nodules along her chest wall. She wanted to die in Quincy, so filled with metastatic disease or cancer in her bones, she made that grueling 300-mile journey back to Quincy and died a few weeks afterwards, coming home, and died of metastatic breast cancer. And it's interesting, at the time, Jefferson and Adams were fighting and who were wonderful friends, and it was Nabby's death that brought the two men together. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson to talk, because Thomas Jefferson always really loved conversations with Nabby. So we look at this and we think, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. That was in 1812, so not too far back from where we are now. And this really was basically the standard of care in surgery through the 1800s. Next slide. If you think about 19th century America, though, for those of you who are familiar with the play Les Mis, that's sort of where we are medically speaking. Cancer is not the biggest issue that people are dying of. The New England Journal of Medicine looked at this, and mostly we're looking at patients. We haven't found cholera yet. We're barely discovering bacteria. So most people in the early 1800s are dying of infectious diseases. This is pre-Civil War. We have the Industrial Revolution with all of the immigration coming in, with crowded tenements and child labor. And you could go to medical school for about $100 for 6 months, and you didn't have to have any college. You had to have no qualifications. You could just go to medical school and come out and be a doctor. So there really wasn't any standardization. The AMA, American Medical Association, was founded in 1847, and really what the stated goals were to standardize medical education and ethics. But it was also founded to really protect the scope of doctor practice. There were a lot of nurses that were starting to sort of encroach on and we can go way back into the whole founding of the AMA, but there were a lot of nurses that were starting to say, hey, we want to have some practice, and the physicians banded together to try to stop that. And in 1868, one of the things that the AMA did is they started to close down and not allow black physicians, who were really at that point had a robust practice, to practice in hospitals, and then also women physicians who had started to practice in hospitals as well. The other thing that the AMA, which is kind of interesting now, is they really started focusing on the treatment of disease and not health and prevention of disease. So they really felt like a physician should be focused on treatment and not health and prevention. And I think that base continues today, where the American medical system really is a treatment-based system rather than a prevention-based system, which is kind of interesting. Next slide. So this is surgery in the late 19th century, so we're coming to the turn of the century here, and I mean, it just looks, I mean, you can see the woman who is presumably supporting the patient, she's looking away because it's too awful. A surgeon standing over the patient with a bloodied hand, no gloves, everybody's there, no mask, they're all just breathing in. It was common at this point for patients, or for physicians, to die of tetanus because of exposure. And this was really Lister's theory of antibacterial or of bacterial contamination of wounds wasn't really adopted until the mid to late 19th century, when we could see bacteria and then started to think about how could we protect wounds from bacterial infection. This was actually a book, Charles Guthrie. You may have heard of Alex Carroll. He's also a Nobel Prize winner, who really discovered how we could start sewing blood vessels together. It turns out that he was kind of a crazy Frenchman, and most of the work was done by this quiet Missouri physician named Charles Guthrie. But Dr. Fisher did a review of their vascular work, and this was one of the studies that Guthrie and Carroll did, which was trying to transplant a dog's head to another dog. And they had several days where they monitored the function of the transplanted dog head. So again, this is where we're at in terms of medical research. Animal research is just beginning, and it's, again, a pretty still barbaric world, and we're not that far away from where we are today. So, next slide. Turn of the century, what really happened is that now there was starting to try to be some separation between what was a physician and then what was just a natural a practitioner, or someone that was going to give you healing water or whatever. So the way that you sort of, I guess, got a reputation as a true physician was to be a wealthy man who would travel from New York and go over to Europe and do a tour of Europe. And at that point, Europe was really setting the standard in surgical care of cancer patients. And then when you came back, you would take all this knowledge as a physician and start to proselytize that at the medical society meetings. So here you can see, this is the man we'll talk about later is the surgeon in the left and the center there. And you see it's a very different picture than just 50 years prior. Everybody's wearing white. They're wearing gloves. So Dr. Halsted, one of the things that he brought back from Germany was the theory of bacteria from Dr. Lister. And his wife, you can see, is the tallest woman there, Anna. They would put carbolic acid all over the wound to kill the bacteria in the wound. And this nurse who was assisting him in his surgeries started complaining that the carbolic acid was breaking down her skin. So he asked Goodyear Rubber Company to make thin gloves for her to protect her hands, and all of his other assistants requested the gloves as well. And then they realized that those patients were also getting less infections. So once a woman ushers in antiseptic technique for the operating room. Next slide. So this is William Halsted, who really encapsulated, and there are several surgeons like him. The thought about cancer at the time was that cancer was similar to bacteria. And therefore, the cancer started in a central location and then spread in sort of a pinwheel type fashion outside of the breast specifically. So not only did you have to remove the cancer, but you had to remove a ton of normal tissue around it. And if the cancer came back, it was because you hadn't done a big enough surgery. And so as anesthesia, very primitive anesthesia with ether was starting to come in, as now patients could survive, quote unquote, these big surgeries, they became enamored with how big can we get. I will say that there are no patient reports of how the women felt after any of these surgeries, but this was very common in, for example, rectal cancer. They would recommend hemicorpectomies, so cutting off the bottom of a patient's body in order to cure rectal cancer. In one of the letters that I read from Dr. Halsted, he said, well, you know, sometimes women get this cancer in their humerus, so maybe we should just start amputating their arm along with their breast, and that would protect them from getting cancer in their humerus. So again, and Dr. Fisher was very generous to Dr. Halsted and said, you know, you can't judge a man by what he thought in the time that he was practicing, But what you can judge is people that continued to follow him. So Dr. Halstead really set the standard of what was called a Halstead radical mastectomy. And some of you might have had aunts, women, grandmothers that had a Halstead radical mastectomy. And what that involved is this procedure that you can see the woman here. It started on the outside of the arm, traveled below the clavicle here, sometimes removed the first 2 or 3 ribs and dissected the lymph nodes underneath those ribs, removed the entire pectoralis muscle, the breast, and then circled back around. And that was all removed in one gigantic piece, including all the lymph nodes under the arm and sometimes the lymph nodes above the clavicle. And that all had to be removed in one piece. Dr. Halstead also believed that just like infections, and some of you still hear this, and I still hear this from my patients, is if you cut into a cancer, it's going to spread. That's way old Halstedian stuff, that like infections, if you busted open into the cancer would spread everywhere. So Dr. Halstead would leave a surgical defect here, and there would be thousands. You can see that little clamp up there is called a mosquito clamp, and there would be thousands of those that his assistants would place on every single blood vessel that was bleeding, and his assistants would go and tie each one of those closed with a black silk suture. He had moved, because of his work in Europe, had moved from catgut to silk sutures. And then 2 or 3 days later, someone else would come in and do a skin graft, usually from the thigh or from the back, to close that wound. Next slide. So Dr. Halstead, this is what women would look like after the Halstead radical mastectomy. And this is a letter that a patient wrote to Dr. Halstead in 1917 and said, "I have not heretofore had the courage to ask you nor any of the Johns Hopkins Hospital staff with whom I came in contact whether the trouble in my breast was of a malignant type or not." So a woman went home looking like this and didn't know if she had cancer or not. 2 months later, go ahead, Helen, he wrote her back, 2 months later, "The tumor in your breast was a cancer. I hope it will be a comfort to you to know that we believe it has been entirely excised and that you will see no signs of its recurrence." About 2 months after that, she developed a recurrence in her lymph nodes above her clavicle and was dead within a year. Next slide. The other difficult part with Halstead was, Halstead did some amazing things. He completely revamped medical training. He made the concept of a residency as part of medical training. He also, again, his antiseptic work, he did the first blood transfusion. His sister was hemorrhaging to death during childbirth. He withdrew his own blood and immediately infused his own blood into his sister. That was the first emergency blood transfusion. He saved his mother's life with emergency gallbladder surgery. So he did really amazing things. He also experimented a lot with cocaine as a topical anesthetic, which of course they did not know was a drug and you could become addicted to. He ruined his career in New York because he could not work without cocaine. He finally figured out that he could work for about 8 or 9 months with cocaine, and then he would take 3 to 4 months off and come down to North Carolina, where he came to High Hampton, his wife's family home in Cashiers, which is now a wonderful resort, and he would treat himself with morphine that he would have delivered to the house. So he could go about 8 or 9 months on cocaine alone, and then come back and recover for 3 to 4 months in North Carolina. So there's a Cinemax show called The Nick that was loosely based on Halstead's life. But this was the man that set the Halstead radical mastectomy he established as a standard of care in breast cancer treatment in 1898, and until Dr. Fisher decided that that was not the way that cancer spread and he was going to take that on, basically in the 50s and 70s, that was the standard of care, and that was the man that really propelled that into being standard of care. Next slide. The other reason it became standard of care was that Hopkins became the standard in medical education. So the AMA requested the Flexner Report of medical education in 1910. And there's a lot of problems with the Flexner Report, but what the Flexner Report said, basically whatever Hopkins does, everybody do that. So it really elevated people like William Cushing, William Stewart Halsted, really elevated them into this place of high prominence. So basically whatever these men thought about care of patients is what was really propelled out into the rest of America. Next slide. Oh, go back one. I did just want to pause for a second to just talk about anti-Semitism in American education as well. So these are all quotes, direct quotes, either from letters or from admission policies that I found. And these are just a smattering, but almost every medical school in America had a history of either quotas, either spoken or unspoken. And we'll get to that a little bit later with Dr. Fisher. But that just was also running on the end of this, you know, when you wonder why there aren't more women in medicine, there aren't more African Americans in medicine. When people talk about the anti-Semitic approaches to medicine, this is really where it comes from. Go ahead. In 1938, the president, FDR, created the National Cancer Institute. Now, the National Cancer Institute is not what we think of now. It was just sort of a division of the NIH. So it was kind of just a little offshoot. And he said, I really want you to start focusing on cancer. Next slide. Which really not a lot happened for the next 20 years in cancer. It was nice. We need to start looking at cancer. They started to sort of do some where's cancer, who's dying of cancer, that sort of thing. But that all changed after World War II. So the Hill-Burton Act was passed in 1946. It was $4 billion, which I don't even know what that is in current dollars. And the goal was to get 4 hospital beds per 1,000 people, and also to develop emergency rooms and care for the poor. It also established separate but equal facilities based on race. It prioritized nursing education to support all these physicians that were coming back from World War II, and was responsible really for the growth of about 40% of our current hospital beds were created by the Hill-Burton Act in the decade between 1950 and 1960. And that sort of started because if you were in rural America, I mean, most of what we talked about is Boston and New York, right? If you're in rural America, you didn't have a hospital, you didn't have a doctor, you were just really separated from the advances in medical care that were happening on the East Coast. So the thoughts of Dr. Halsted, again, being from Johns Hopkins, and then now with all this sort of movement towards hospital-based systems just spread across the United States. And all of these surgeons coming back from World War II had seen worse. I mean, they'd operated in field hospitals. They'd done amputations without anesthesia. So these were surgeons that had the answer to the problems that plagued America. Next slide. I did also want to mention the other thing that Dr. Fisher brings to cancer care is the concept of a randomized trial. With COVID and the vaccines, we're all very familiar with randomized trials ad nauseum now, but this was the first randomized trial that was ever done, and it was done in patients that had tuberculosis. So they were diagnosed with tuberculosis. It was published in the British Medical Journal in 1948, and these patients with tuberculosis were randomized to get streptomycin plus supportive care, or just supportive care alone, which basically is, you know, laying in a hospital bed, hopefully you make it. And what they found was that patients, so they randomly selected which patients would get these treatments. Before, what Dr. Halsted and his group had been doing is they would just selectively report the patients that they wanted to. They would say, oh, we did 50 patients and they all did great. Well, nobody knew what happened to the other 20 patients. Why did you choose these patients? Was it because the other patients weren't good? Was it because they weren't, you know, the same race? So the concept of randomization really didn't happen until this trial came out in 1948 and created somewhat of a splash, but not as big as you would think. Next slide. Even into the 1950s, women were still, I just wanted to bring everybody back, so we're in the 1950s, we're 60 years after Halsted, and women are still getting Halsted radical mastectomy. And these are starting to be the first reports of what is happening to women after a Halsted radical mastectomy. So if you imagine they don't have a pectoralis muscle, all the lymph node drainage systems have been removed, And this is an older woman that's as far as she can lift her arm, and that you can see the swelling in her biceps and the lower part of her arm. And in this New England Journal of Medicine publication, some degree of swollen arm after radical mastectomy in about 70% of women. And so about 70% of women were having this surgery and were left basically with an unusable arm. Next slide. So there enters our hero for tonight, Dr. Fisher. This is one of the statements that I think really encapsulates what he thought about cancer and about medicine. He was, as you know, Pittsburgh born and bred. He went to the University of Pittsburgh for undergrad and for college, and then also for medical school. His great uncle was a surgeon who had moved to Case Western and had not been able to get his medical degree, but began to do experiments with cortisol and actually wrote a letter on his behalf to get him over the quota. They had already accepted their quota of Jewish medical students. So Dr. Rogoff wrote a letter to get him into medical school. And he was also the second Jewish surgeon to be accepted to the University of Pennsylvania surgical program. The only other surgical resident who was Jewish who had been accepted was the son of the Gimbel's department store, proving, I guess, that if you have enough money, we can overlook the fact that you're Jewish. But Dr. Fisher was accepted to the University of Pennsylvania surgery program, which is really a wonderful training program. And he trained at the University of Pennsylvania under a general who had operated and saved Dwight D. Eisenhower's life. His name was Isidore Radvin. And that was the person that really impacted Dr. Fisher the most. Dr. Radvin was emphatic that surgeons should be researchers, that it wasn't just enough to be a good surgeon. You also had to think about why you were doing these things. And when Dr. Fisher reflects on his time of being a surgical resident, he said, "I began to realize that the basis for many of the operations that I was performing was questionable. I realized the need for a greater understanding of the biology of the diseases that I was training." And that's a remarkable thing for a surgeon even now to say. Usually surgeons are like something like broken leg, fixed leg, like they're just very, this is what I do. But Dr. Fisher really was a cancer biologist at heart and wanted to know, why are we doing this instead of just as this is the way it's been done. Next slide. I should also say, in the 60s when he was coming out, transplantation medicine was really big. Everybody was doing transplants, and that was a really big thing. And I get the sense from reading that he did the first transplant in Pittsburgh. He developed the organ sharing network in Pittsburgh before, as many of you know, Dr. Starzl came in to start doing liver transplant work. But I get the sense that Dr. Fisher was not happy doing just a Me Too surgery. Oh, I did a transplant, the other person did a transplant. That was not what he wanted. He wanted to do something big. And so he was invited by his old mentor. He got a phone call to go down to the Stone House at NIH and to talk about Dr. Radvin had been asked by the president to start looking at ways to decrease the burden of cancer. We don't have any research. We need to know how to start treating cancer. So he invited a bunch of people, and he called Dr. Fisher and said, "Hey, I want you to come to this cancer meeting." And Fisher was like, "I'm not interested in cancer, but when your old boss and a general who operated on the president calls you, you go down." So he went down, and he came back, and this really marked a shift in his research. So for 10 years, along with his brother, he started to look at the model of cancer spread. And what he found, and I would love to see the notebooks where he starts documenting this, he started injecting tumors into lab rats and then drawing their blood and looking at their lymphatic system. And what he found was cancer cells in the blood and cancer cells in the lymphatic system. And that was the aha moment where he realized that cancer was not a localized disease, that the answer was not just to do bigger and bigger surgeries. We were dealing, as we all understand now, with a systemic issue with cancer spreading all over the body. So it wasn't possible, a bigger surgery wasn't going to get you anywhere because the cat was already out of the bag, the horse had already left the barn. So this model of the Halsted model of if you just did bigger and bigger and removed more Dr. Fisher realized with his research that that was not the correct way to think about cancer. Does that make sense to everyone? Am I losing people in the science? Okay. I can get kind of nerdy about the science. So next slide, Helen. Thank you. So he realizes that's not what we're thinking about. Next slide. What Dr. Fisher realizes is the way we understand cancer now, which you can have a tiny little tumor, but if that thing's aggressive, then cells can spread to the rest of the body. And so this was really called the systemic model or the Fisher model of cancer spread, which is how we understand cancer today. And that was based on laboratory research that was done here at the University of Pittsburgh. Next slide. So this was just mind-blowing. And I don't think anybody was ready for this. Dr. Fisher was ready for it, but I don't think anybody was ready for it. And what Dr. Fisher realized is that now we have this idea in the lab, but now we need to test it in human subjects. I've got to have my next model. I've done it in the rats, I know what happens in the rat, but now I got to have a different model, and that's where he started the randomized trials in breast cancer. Go ahead, next slide. I'm going to just take a little bit of a detour in that a lot of work has been done. If any of you has read The Emperor of All Maladies, it talks about the development of chemotherapy. That was really based on nitrogen mustard exposure of some troops and accidental nitrogen mustard exposure of troops in France. And using that data, they developed a drug called amphotericin, which was later turned into methotrexate. And they really started to cure a lot of what we call liquid tumors, so lymphomas and leukemias. That those drugs were able to go in and kill those tumors for the first time. In 1965, we had the first cure of ALL. In 1970, we were curing Hodgkin's disease. And in the 1970s, we started to look at multi-drug regimens for breast cancer. Next slide. Now, I will tell you, this is a slide that really upsets me. Because when they figured out in 1960s, 1970s that they could cure childhood ALL, look at that. From 1970, this is the survival rate. So you can see the number of patients surviving. You want to be up here closer to 100 and not down here closer to 0. 1968, 1970, most children were dying of pediatric ALL. By 1972 to 1975, you're curing 65 to 70%. So they realized they could cure kids of cancer, and they were able to show that. I mean, that was how fast that treatment was adopted, like so fast in medicine. Within 5 years, 2 to 5 years, they're curing all these kids. And you can find out more about that in Dr. Mukherjee's wonderful book and Ken Burns' documentary. Next slide. Along with that is coming along this concept that Americans can do anything. So if we just put enough money and enough power and enough science, we went to the moon, now let's cure cancer. So as some of you may know, JFK announces we're going to the moon. A few years later, we're on the moon. What happened there is that we had all the technology available to us to go to the moon because of World War II. Next slide. When Nixon declared war on cancer in 1970, we didn't have the basic understanding, besides the work that Dr. Fisher was doing, of cancer. If you think about now, the immunotherapy, the DNA mapping, all of the things that we're doing now, when Nixon said we're going to cure cancer in 10 years, I think it was a little bit of American exceptionalism that we thought, well, if we can go to the moon in 8 years, I'm sure we can cure cancer in 8 years, let's just do this. I don't think that we had an understanding of how much we didn't know about cancer. We didn't have an understanding of how much we didn't know about cancer. And so I think that is why that we wonder, why haven't we cured cancer yet? But I really think we're sort of putting the cart before the horse by declaring war on this thing, and then we showed up with like a little pipette, and we needed a bunch of other really advanced testing for cancer. Next slide. So I will just bring you up. We're in the 1970s now, so you guys might remember Richard Nixon resigns from the White House in early August. Next. Mr. Ford is sworn in that same day. Next. Grants Nixon is pardoned in the beginning of September. And 3 weeks later, Betty Ford is diagnosed with breast cancer. So, at this time, next slide, Dr. Fisher had been working on the first randomized trial for breast cancer. Based on his data, he knew that bigger surgery was not going to save more women. But the rest of the country did not believe him, and surgeons were aggressively telling him that that wasn't true. So he had begun a trial called NSABP B04, which looked at whether women needed a radical mastectomy or a modified radical mastectomy. It was the first randomized trial done in breast cancer patients, and the first surgical randomized trial done in breast cancer patients. And he had been convinced by the NIH to come and give an update. People were really excited about this data. And there was also some controversy brewing in some of the older surgeons at very well-known institutions like Yale and Memorial Sloan Kettering. Those surgeons were very angry at this data. At the time, the surgeons were doing probably between 200 and 300 mastectomies a year, and that was the bulk of how they were making their money, was on radical mastectomies. So, other reasons as well, but this is the way it had always been done. It's the way that the doctors that had trained them had done it before them. There was no reason to change. Dr. Fisher started to see that there was no benefit in women getting the radical mastectomy. So the same weekend that Betty Ford is recovering from her mastectomy, Dr. Fisher is across the street from Walter Reed at the NIH giving his update on breast cancer. Now, somebody had told Dr. Fisher that this was going to be a small gathering of scientists, and it was just going to be an update to the breast cancer community. This was not going to be a big to-do. This was just going to be a 2-year update. The trial wasn't done yet. Just tell people what you're thinking. Well, as soon as the reporters got word that the First Lady was having breast cancer over here, and they were out there daily with daily news reports, everything going crazy. Because if you think about it, at this time, I mean, it's still a big deal that Mike and Carol Brady were sharing a bed. I mean, it was still considered pornographic to say breast on television. So now we've got a First Lady, we've got breasts, and we've got a conference happening across the street. So it turned out that that was the first really national conference on breast cancer inadvertently. And if you read some of the descriptions, it was all these like buttoned up scientists and doctors, and then all these like ragtag journalists sitting in between them, and it was quite the mix. So at that time, he announced the results, announced the preliminary results that there was no benefit to doing the radical mastectomy. The Halsted radical mastectomy was dead, and there was no need to do that disfiguring and terrible surgery on women. Again, that sounds great. Side note, he also presented the first data that showed a benefit to chemotherapy in women, and because of Dr. Fisher, who went over and consulted on Ms. Ford's cancer, she was one of the first women to receive adjuvant chemotherapy, a medicine called LPAM. And she took that orally for 2 years based on the results of Dr. Fisher's trial that he presented that same weekend. Next slide. So, NSABP B04, his first trial, radical surgery or the radical mastectomy is the picture on your left. Modified radical mastectomy is on the right. Dr. Fisher, surgeons have been taught one thing: radical surgery saves lives. It was Bernard Fisher who changed their mind. Next slide. So you think, great, we know what to do now, right? Next slide. This is great. We've got another thing, radical surgery. We're going to, help women. Next slide. Let's celebrate. The radical mastectomy is dead. Next slide. Yeah, no. So, the op-eds that came out and the backlash he received with physical threats, with physicians standing up and screaming at him, grabbing him by the collar, refusing to accept randomized data. And if you think about it, they didn't, in their defense, they didn't have a vocabulary to look at data through randomized clinical trials. They had just been looking at, hey, this guy who I really respect said it's the right thing to do, so I'm just going to do that. And then this guy said this, and that's what I'm going to do. So it really became a fighting match over the radical mastectomy versus the modified radical mastectomy. Next slide. So, we remember, we can cure kids of ALL, 2 to 5 years, boom, kids are being cured. It takes 20 years for surgeons to stop doing radical mastectomy. 20 years. Incredible. Next slide. Dr. Fisher persevered. His next trial was a trial looking at let's do even less surgery. So if we don't need a big radical surgery, perhaps it's possible to just remove the tumor and a little bit of tissue around it and do some radiation afterwards, and maybe that can cure as many patients as a mastectomy. This was B06, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1985. I will say that this trial was also repeated all around the world. I mean, this is one of the very few trials where about 10,000 women have been tested to see if this is true. It's one of the most studied, besides some cardiovascular disease studies, this is one of the most studied questions in medicine, is whether women can preserve their breast or not. Just completely crazy. So what his study showed is that women can have a mastectomy or they can have a lumpectomy, and the radicalness of the surgery does not offer a more radical cure. So oftentimes when women are sitting and they say, you know, what should I do? How should I, you know, what are my choices? Just take my breast off, I don't care. It really is a choice, and that was the point, is that women could choose what surgery they wanted to have. Next slide. Once again, choice of surgery doesn't affect survival. Now you all know the surgeons have changed. They're going to just start doing this surgery. It's going to be wonderful. They don't have to do these terrible disfiguring surgeries to women anymore. Next slide. We're all going to celebrate and be together. Next slide. No. Yeah, no. They had to legislate in 11 states. They passed legislation that surgeons had to discuss options with women for breast cancer surgery, because women were not getting told that they could have a lumpectomy or a modified radical mastectomy. So, next slide. And I mean, surgeons are doing a little bit better, but it still takes over 10 years for the vast majority of American women to receive a lumpectomy over a modified radical mastectomy. Next slide. And part of it, I would say, is that Dr. Fisher teamed up in the mid-90s with some breast cancer advocates. And next slide. The breast cancer advocacy movement actually was built and really learned some lessons on the HIV and AIDS advocacy movement. They started to lobby Congress. They realized that there was no way to get money allocated to breast cancer specifically unless you went to Washington. That's where the big money was. It still is where the big money is today. In the 1993 budget, it was the first time that a specific cancer had been cordoned off to have specific funding. It allocated $325 million for breast cancer research, which is a 450% increase in what they were spending on breast cancer currently. They also started to develop the Department of Defense, and I won't go into this whole story, but they couldn't get enough people to sign this one bill, so the Department of Defense agreed. For those of you that remember the tailhook scandal, they were coming off of the tailhook scandal, and the DoD needed a little like happy feminine energy, so there is a report of a woman sitting down with a DoD general, and he's like, "Ma'am, we love women. We are very excited to serve women in the Department of Defense." Yeah, okay. So that all kind of came together to get some of the biggest DoD funding for breast cancer. And then these are some activists on the left here that encouraged women to write into their congresspeople, and they were hoping to get about 100,000 letters, and they got 600,000 letters written by women all over America to write to their congressmen to talk about increasing funding for breast cancer. Next slide. So, I'll just, in the interest of time, Dr. Fisher had over 500 peer-reviewed publications. He was on track to be was nominated for the Nobel Prize. He had received the Lasker Prize, which is really the Nobel Prize in medicine, and it was due to his pioneering work. If you know anyone who's gotten chemotherapy for breast cancer, it was because of Bernie Fisher. Next slide. If you know anyone who has ever taken a medication, one of his really legacy trials was the first trial to ever show that you could prevent cancer by taking a medication called tamoxifen. So high-risk women could prevent cancer by taking a medication that blocked estrogen. Next slide. If you've ever had a person that has had lymphedema, the reason we do sentinel lymph node biopsies and not full axillary node dissections is because of Bernie Fisher. And if you know anyone who hasn't gotten chemotherapy, there was a test called the Oncotype now that we run on a lot of estrogen receptor positive cancers that shows that many women who we would have given chemotherapy before, now we can do an intelligence test on their cancer and decide whether they need chemotherapy or not. And Dr. Fisher, through the NSABP at the University of Pittsburgh, is the reason that that is absolutely standard of care now for every breast cancer patient who's ER positive. Next slide. For those of you that are colon cancer fans, I didn't even get into his contributions with colorectal cancer, but Dr. Fisher also, through the NSABP, did some of the seminal work along with his partner, Dr. Walmark, in preventing patients from having to have a colostomy or of having what we call sphincter-sparing treatment for rectal cancer. So he was also very involved in that. Next slide. So Dr. Fisher is on track. He's been president of the largest organization in cancer medicine called ASCO. He's gotten the Lasker Prize. He's given the Karnofsky Lecture. He has been nominated at least twice for the Nobel Prize, which is very rare for practicing physicians. Most Nobel Prize winners are PhDs, not MDs. And that is when a young enterprising journalist at the Chicago Tribune called Scott Cruson meets up with a Capitol Hill staffer in a bar in Washington, D.C., and starts talking about what's called the Poisson Affair. And some of you may remember some of this. I was talking to the Chapmans about some other controversies that happened. In the mid-90s, there was journalistic and congressional oversight over many things. Some of you may remember the Golden Toilets or the Stanford Yacht. That was in the military. It was led by a Congressman, John Dingell from Michigan. He had figured out, for example, that bottled water was actually just tap water that was being sold to the American public as something better. He was really into oversight. And he started with a physician called Robert Gallo, had decided that Dr. Gallo, that case was just decided. Dr. Gallo had received basically some contaminated samples that had the HIV virus from France. And so he had been credited with discovering the HIV virus, but there was some controversy that he had made up his results and it was actually a French lab. Dr. Gallo was vilified by the press, brought in for questioning. He was, his career was ruined. Another Nobel Prize laureate, David Baltimore, was doing some research in viruses causing cancer. He and one of his research assistants were accused of scientific misconduct. There was just a long list in the mid-90s of these scientists. It was about a 3-year cycle. And Dr. Fisher, unfortunately, got caught up with that. Probably Dr. Anderson can tell us more about the Poisson Affair than we ever wanted to know, but basically the NSABP had partnered with some Canadian doctors to enroll patients in their trials, and one of those was a very confident Canadian surgeon who decided that he knew best, and he was not going to allow his patients to be randomized. And on an audit, some of the auditors from the NSABP, from Dr. Fisher's team, went up to Canada and opened up a patient's chart and saw one pathology report that said true and one pathology report that said false in French. And they were the same patient but had different dates. And this started a whole thing where it turns out that Dr. Poisson had been falsifying some of the data on the women's records in order to get them into the clinical trial. Nothing was changed. The women still had breast cancer. He had just changed the dates or changed some minor information so that the women would be randomized in order to get the lumpectomy, which he felt like was a better treatment. Dr. Fisher was informed of this, he addressed it, they reran the statistics, and that's the beauty of a randomized trial. If you get it is built for these types of issues. If he took those patients out, reanalyzed the data, it absolutely had no impact whatsoever on the final results of the clinical trial. That, however, was not good enough because now there was blood in the water in Washington and somebody had to go down. And that turned out being Dr. Fisher. And there was a long drawn out, he was removed from his post at the NSABP, had to actually sue the University of Pittsburgh. There was a lot of controversy that happened to that, and this was a man in his 70s and 80s who was a venerated scientist. I will say, in doing a lot of this work, that the Pittsburgh community and the Pittsburgh medical community, 100% solidarity with Dr. Fisher, as well as the overall international cancer community. I have seen letters coming in from all over the world talking about Dr. Fisher and his contributions and how this is a witch hunt and that Dr. Fisher is a scapegoat for this controversy. Next slide. So finally in 1997, he is cleared of all charges, has a reconciliation with the University of Pittsburgh, and but really those 3 years, as he describes in many interviews, said that, you know, it took so long and his life was over and felt like his reputation was ruined. I will say that the NIH and the University of Pittsburgh asked for several of his trials, of his seminal trials, to be labeled scientific misconduct, even though he had never been accused and there was never any evidence of scientific misconduct on Dr. Fisher's part. So, and then this is his obituary when he died at 101 in 2019. Next slide. So that's sort of the history of breast cancer, and Dr. Fisher was always saying that we need to look forward. We need to look forward. You know, eventually we're not going to have to do surgery for breast cancer. We're going to get more targeted therapies. And as we move forward in treatment, I think it's important for us to take a look back and say, why isn't everyone benefiting equally from these innovations that we're seeing? And the biggest really still inequity that we see is even in women who are stage matched, we don't see as big of a decline in the death rate from breast cancer in Black women as we do in white women. And we're not sure why that is. There's also, on the one hand, not enough patients are getting curative treatment, but on the other hand, there's been an increase at about 14% per year in women getting prophylactic mastectomies, so either removing a breast that doesn't have cancer in it or requesting both breasts to be moved. And part of that is the impact of celebrity, and there's a couple papers that show that after Angelina Jolie made her announcement that she had been tested positive for the BRCA1 gene, that led to a bump up in bilateral mastectomies for American women. Next slide. So what do we know in 2023? Well, we know that cancer is a systemic disease. So we know that the size of surgery does not impact survival. And we know, hopefully, the one before that, yeah.
Okay,
That's just my final one. Sorry, Helen. And we know that the biology of cancer is really what's driving things. So, and that really is where Dr. Fisher led us to, is that he kept us, as a surgeon, he led us to less and less surgery for breast cancer and really decided and really told us that where we really need to focus is not the disease that's in the breast. That is not what is going to be killing these women. It's going to be the disease that is outside the breast, and targeting that cancer that's going to be the cancer that's spreading is really important, and that's what we need to do. So he also emphasized that early detection and prevention is actually where we need to start going. So I work with an organization called earlier.org, and they're all about just finding an early detection or an earlier test for detecting breast cancer, circulating tumor cells in the blood. You know, once we see it on a mammogram, that's already millions and billions of cells. How can we find it earlier? So. And that is my talk. I'm a little bit over. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I know that, yeah.
There was a book published by Consumer Reports called a book published by Consumer Reports called Licit and Illicit Drugs, and they have a whole big chapter on Halstead. And according to this article, when he was young, he was a cocaine addict and really had trouble getting off of it. And then suddenly he was cured of it. And the way he became cured of it was to become a heroin addict. And because he had access to pure drugs, unlike street drugs, and he could control how much he was taking. He could, as a heroin addict, they claimed he could still function as a surgeon. They had all kinds of good things to say about him, surgical techniques he developed and all. But the idea that he could function as a heroin addict was mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of cover-up too about he would go into his office, and I think, yeah, there was.
According to this article,
Yeah.
one of they claimed there were 4 people who really started Hopkins Medical School,
That's right.
and he was one of them.
Yep, the foreman.
And one day, one of his associates walked into the office and he was shooting up.
Yeah.
And they kept it quiet as long as he could function.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. He was away. He was away from the school more than he was there at the end of his career. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Not to digress then, but
Yeah.
does this story give us any hope that Dr. Fauci is going to answer to some of his crimes against the American people?
Yeah, there is going to be. I think that there is congressional oversight, and now that Mr. Dingell is not in charge of congressional oversight, I don't know if that will happen. But I do know that there are continual physicians and continual oversight by the NIH and by the
Time to
NCI.
go after Fauci.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
a
That's
cou-
right.
a couple
Dr. Anderson.
things.
Yeah. Please take the stage. Yeah.
One book, if you want to get an entertaining view of what happened with Bernie, was Vince DeVita, who was the head of the NCI during the 70s and 80s. He wrote a book called The Death of Cancer. And I would highly recommend that because Bernie's featured prominently in that.
Do you want to just say who you are, Stuart?
Oh, Stuart Anderson. I worked with Bernie from '89 to 2010. So I was the 06 statistician. Unfortunately, I wasn't the original statistician, but when I came here in '89, I took it over. I was the guy that drew the short straw. But anyway, a couple things. You're a radiation oncologist, and so I was a little surprised that you didn't mention the radiation arms in both BO4 and BO6. It makes it a little more complicated.
Yeah.
But you know, it's considered local therapy, and so the standard today is lumpectomy and radiation, not just lumpectomy alone.
Yeah.
So the other thing, just one more thing, I'll talk to you maybe after.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one more thing. Can you go back to your slide with all of his the things that he contributed?
Yeah. There's so many.
Yeah, I don't think. I don't think you mentioned preoperative.
Yep.
So that was really Bernie was one of the I don't know that he was the first one that thought it up, but if you read his 1980 Karnofsky lecture, he talks about it. And what that is they give the chemotherapy before they do the surgery. Mm-hmm. So if the chemo is effective, it downstages the disease. It makes the tumor smaller, and then if it's not, then they can use different types of chemo. Of course, you still do the surgery, and then that was compared to surgery, chemotherapy after surgery.
That's right.
So that was protocol B18,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and that showed the equivalence. Equivalence, by the way, is just like a negative. It's very hard. Logically, like my training's in mathematics, and I mean originally, and it's very hard to show negatives, right? Mm-hmm. And so it turns out these are called equivalence trials. There's some other things that they're called. There's a little nuance, but the point is that he also sort of made that a very common practice, and that's a real feather in his cap as well. But this was a wonderful talk, by the way. I just wanted to tell you that. It's very good.
Thank you. think that the fact that he would leave cancer in a woman's body, you're exactly right, Stuart, that was crazy. People thought, oh my gosh, all these people are going to die if we don't do surgery first. So the fact that Bernie Fisher wanted to open up a trial, which we do very commonly now, and it really does show the biology of the disease, but that was a groundbreaking, B18 was another groundbreaking study, yeah.
The last slide you showed about prevention. Does that include? There's every once in a while there's an article about, say, cured meat, like hot dogs and things, chemicals in our food. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So I always refer people to thecancerdietitian.com. It's my friend Julie. She's a certified dietitian. She loves all this stuff and goes into deep dives. As far as we know for breast cancer, the only ingestion risk factors are alcohol. But some of the other processed meats and that sort of thing seems to be more risk for colon cancer, but not for breast cancer. The breast itself the non-lactating breast is hard to get things into. There just aren't a lot of trains going into that station, not a lot of blood flow there. So the typical things we think about in terms of cancer are not usually related to breast cancer. So, good question. Yeah, did you have a question?
Just in general, he lived to be 101.
Yeah.
If he wasn't stopped by that scandal, do you think he would have come up with other discoveries?
Well, he wrote 30 or 40 papers after that. I wrote many with him. So he must, I would guess he wrote at least 40 papers after that, some of them very seminal. So he wrote, he wrote papers at least to 2010, I think beyond that. I think he wrote some papers when he was in his 90s. He worked until he was 99. He was still sharp too.
Yes.
Are there other people or another individual who's taken his mantle and furthered his work in any way?
Well, I would say
Norm, yeah, Dr. Walmart took over at the head of the NSABP, and that is sort of who's taken over the NSABP. There's been a lot of reconfiguration of clinical trials. As with most things, it was very broad, and now it's all coming together into one clinical trial group, which is good and bad. But with the expense of clinical trials, they're also now doing more statistical modeling on not doing these randomized trials where you have to follow women for 20 years, but how can we do, I'll just say fancy statistics, to start answering questions faster, because these type of trials would be almost cost prohibitive now to follow them.
But I will say it's very hard. No one's really replaced Bernie.
Yeah,
and there's
correct.
also a reason in that in his era, he was given latitude
Correct.
by the NCI because Bernie was the only guy that was publishing anything. Vince loved him because that was, promoting clinical trials. So now, a strong personality like Bernie, and there were a couple other in the field, a guy named Mortel at Mayo Clinic, other people, but those people have been tapped down. They're not given as much leeway.
There is more, you want to bet on a sure thing now, and so there aren't as many mavericks that are allowed to think in new and different ways.
But if it was a sure thing, then you wouldn't be doing a clinical trial.
That's right, the Halstead would be the sure thing. That's exactly right, yeah.
Could you say something about male breast cancer? It exists.
It exists, yeah. Yes, the male breast cancer makes up about 6 to 8% of breast cancers and is common, especially in BRCA2 carriers. So we do, I have a very passionate male breast cancer patient who's in my survivorship clinic, and I think it is important for men to know that breast cancer does affect men. Most of the time for clinical trials, due to ovarian suppression and all these other issues, men are not included in breast cancer trials, which does make it hard to usually extrapolate some of the data. But most men The breast cancer is found at an earlier stage because it's easier to palpate, and it shows up a little bit earlier, so the cure rates are pretty high for male breast cancer.
Does your patient have the BRCA?
He is. He's
So
yeah.
they use male patients often to find out if the BRCA's in
That's
the
right.
female.
That's right.
So they use, what's her name, Mary Claire King was really
Yeah, male breast cancer, bilateral breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer. Yes, yes.
This is a huge question, but where are we at on gene therapy for cancer?
Yeah, the CRISPR is very interesting.
A
Yeah.
lot of this is
Yes, that is a huge question, yes. And as a radiation oncologist, I'm just an amateur medical oncologist, so I will answer in the best way that I know. I think that I have been in radiation oncology for almost 20 years now, and I have been through at least 4 practice changing, this is going to change the world. You all might remember when Martha Stewart went to prison, that was for Erbitux, insider trading, and Erbitux was going to be the drug, it was an EGFR inhibitor that was going to cure all of us, it was going to be amazing, and it sort of crashed and burned. And Avastin was another one. For the first time in my career, I am seeing stage 4 lung cancer patients living 2 and 3 years, and that's with immunotherapy. So I think rather than gene therapy for most adult cancers, I think that gene therapy probably will be, in my opinion, will be more likely to be impacting childhood cancers. But for adult cancers, I think if we can teach the immune system to recognize cancer cells as different, that is where we need to go. But it's a very delicate thing to just tell it to go to the cancer cell and not to attack the whole body. And that's the tightrope.
Have the ability to hide from your immune system.
Yep. That's one of the things that makes it a cancer cell. Yeah. Our bodies are forming cancer cells all the time. And our body detects cancer cells and gets rid of them before it becomes a problem, multiple times probably over the course of our lifetime. But there's something special that allows that. There's multiple things that allow cancer cells to grow, but one of those is that they don't show up to the immune system. Yeah.
You touched on this at the very end about blood tests for cancer.
Yeah.
How would you go about that? I mean, would you have to have like the BRCA gene to get tested, or is it going to become part of like regular screening?
So Agnes is asking about blood testing for cancer. Currently, there is no blood test for breast cancer that's FDA approved, so that is all experimental. What we do know is that we all have circulating tumor cells in our blood, and if we could detect a certain level of those in a blood test, right now really the only cancer that we have that's screened with for is prostate cancer with PSA. So there isn't a blood test, but I think that it is possible. It's just getting those circulating tumor cells, even in patients with active cancer, are very rare, and so it's getting enough blood, you might want to have a mammogram instead of having to give 6 pints of blood to get all the tumor cells. So it's trying to get a very sensitive test that detects those those circulating tumor cells. But there is some work being done on whether patients are responding to treatment based on how many circulating tumor cells they have in their blood, but it's hard to find them, which is the problem they're having right now. Yeah.
Last month there was a story that UPMC is starting trials for a breast cancer vaccine. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know the trial that they have open, but yes, they are, and that again is trying to use our immune system to say if we know that this cancer is going to form in you, can we teach your immune system, hey, look for this, guys, so that it doesn't even have the chance to form or get as big to be on a mammogram. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
There is a controversy now within the medical community about I'm having a senior moment. Mammograms, sorry.
Yeah, the controversy about mammograms,
for-
yes.
And they
Yeah.
are saying that women over the age of 70 or 75
Yes,
don't need to have them
Mhm.
anymore.
yes.
What is your feeling on that?
If you are 70 years old and you know you're going to die before you reach 75, then you don't need a mammogram. But if you don't know that, then the mammograms are helpful if we think you're going to live long enough for the breast cancer to bother you. So if you were 100 years old, I would say definitely don't get a mammogram. But I think that has to be in conversation with your doctor. Are you healthy enough? Part of the role of screening is if we find something, are we going to do something about it? So I just had this conversation with an elderly relative about having a colonoscopy at 87. And if we find a colon cancer, I don't know that he would be healthy enough to have a colectomy. I don't know that he would recover from that, or he would have to go to a rehabilitation facility. He's not having any symptoms. He's totally fine. So should we really do that test? For breast cancer, a lumpectomy is a relatively easy outpatient procedure. So I usually counsel patients to talk to their doctor and ask their doctor in their very foggy crystal ball if they think that they have 5 years to live. And in my opinion, if you are living by yourself and you're taking care of yourself and doing your own finances and driving yourself and getting your own groceries, to me that is a person. I mean, we could all get hit by a bus or hit by someone coming out of a hidden driveway. There seem to be a lot of those in Pittsburgh. We don't know, but if you and your doctor think you're gonna live 5 years, then I think it is not a bad thing to do a mammogram. If on the other hand you think if they find something, I'm old enough and I don't want to do anything about it anyway, then I wouldn't get a mammogram. It is unlikely, even breast cancer that's diagnosed in older women is unlikely to be the cause of death because there's so many other competing causes of cardiovascular mortality.
Would you make the same recommendation for a pap smear?
I don't know the pap smear data as well, but I think we have to be careful in lumping patients together. We all are familiar with racism, sexism, and I think we have to be careful in medicine of not practicing ageism. Age is just a number. If I have a patient who comes in and they're 50, they're on dialysis, and they've had bilateral knee amputations because of poorly controlled diabetes, the chance that that person is going to be alive in 10 years is probably going to be a lot less than a woman that I saw just a few months ago who was 90, and she was moving her refrigerator, and at 90 was moving her own refrigerator, and it hit her breast, and that's how she felt a breast mass. And so we were like, well, and she was sitting on her front porch when the EMS came, and they like walked past her into the house, and then they came back and they were like, who's the one? And she's like, well, it was me. And they were like, oh my gosh. So if you're that healthy, then I think again, longevity predicts for longevity. So I think it's a conversation to have with your doctor. Mm-hmm. But I think if you have a 5-year life expectancy, and you are willing to undergo the surgery or the treatments that would be recommended for that, then it's reasonable to talk to your doctor about that. Yeah.
Did Dr. Fisher live in Squirrel Hill?
I didn't even mention Squirrel Hill the whole time. Yes, Dr. Fisher grew up on Sherbrooke Street and lived in Squirrel Hill his entire life. The man that changed breast cancer across the world grew up and lived in Aylesboro.
Yeah,
that's the street where he lived.
And he's on the Alderdice Alumni Hall of Fame.
Yeah, he was the first. He was the first class. He was the original class.
In 2009, he was inducted into the Taylor Alderdice Hall of Fame as the inaugural class.
He also remembers.
Someday, so I thought I'd tell
Oh, did you? Yes. Okay.
He also remembers before Alderdice was built. So he was in the second graduating class at Alderdale.
And he was in the second graduating class of Taylor.
He was in the first class that actually, when they had the first Hall of Fame class.
The first what?
The first Hall of Fame.
The first Hall of Fame.
That was
class
recent.
His brother Eddie was also, I think. Eddie was a very. Eddie was.
We didn't even go to.
The circulating tumor. Eddie and another fellow actually found that in 1956.
Mm-hmm.
It's in a Nature paper. Mm-hmm. So he was quite prominent in his own right.
Yeah.
And I taught Norman Woolmark's son, Steve.
Oh my
At
gosh.
Alderdice, who
Dr.
also
Walmark's son
made
at Alderdice.
history in his own right in ways that were quite different than what his father did.
Well, are there any questions online? Any online questions? Probably everybody's logged off. Yeah.
And how many, we had how many people online?
About 30.
30 people online? Wonderful. Well, everyone has been so lovely in Squirrel Hill, and everyone that I have met loves Pittsburgh. It has just been overwhelming. So I talked to my husband who's back in North Carolina, and I said, I think, everybody's really excited about Pittsburgh. And he was like, do you remember growing up in Illinois? Why don't you go back in December? So maybe I'll come back in December and visit you guys and really see if everybody still loves Pittsburgh. I'm not in December. But thank you all again, and thank you for these programs. I really enjoyed it.
There is a joke that you taught me. Thank goodness they don't have.
Well, thank you.